"You people don't belong here," Officer Brent Keller growled before slamming the frail, black, elderly woman onto the blistering, hot hood of the car, ignoring her violent coughing and the trembling hands reaching out in desperation. She was not just a victim. She was the one who had once written the very policies these officers were now trampling. But justice does not need to shout. It arrived silently in the form of her daughter, someone no badge could intimidate. "Where do you live? What would you do if you witnessed this?" It happened in the dead heat of a Tuesday afternoon, when the sun bore down with the full weight of summer, cracking the asphalt and drying the breath out of the air. Hattie Monroe, 73, moved slowly down the sidewalk of Ashmore Street, her canvas shopping bag swinging gently from her forearm. Her pace wasn't slow from frailty, it was methodical, the way someone moves when they know every step in a neighborhood that rarely acknowledges their presence. The houses stood tall, white picket fences bright under the sun, identical garden flags fluttering, a perfect illusion of peace. Then the cruiser pulled up, no sirens, no warning, just the sudden, sharp screech of tires carving into silence. Officer Brent Keller stepped out, not in a hurry, not out of breath. He moved like gravity bent around him. He didn't run, he didn't ask. He pointed and said, "Ma'am, hands where I can see them." Hattie stopped mid-step. Her hand trembled as she tried to clutch her bag tightly. "Is there hands? Now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Brent closed the distance in 4 strides, one hand on his holster, the other already lifting his radio, as if protocol had been fulfilled somewhere invisible. The street was still. A sprinkler clicked in the distance. No one came out. He grabbed her elbow, not gently, and pushed her toward the hood of his cruiser. Her bones knocked against the metal with a hollow clunk. The sun had been baking that car for hours. Hattie gasped, the kind of gasp that comes from skin screaming. She couldn't form a word. Her hands, aged and spotted, scrabbled for balance, but found nothing but air and heat. Don't resist. She wasn't. She couldn't. He forced her wrists behind her back. The cuffs snapped on with mechanical precision. Not rage, not chaos, just policy. That cold, precise cruelty. She started coughing, a deep, barking sound that rattled from her gut to her throat. Her whole frame shook with it. Keller didn't react. "Sir?" a voice called out, hesitant. A young woman, white, no older than 25, stood at the edge of her driveway. Her phone hung limply in one hand, keys in the other. "She didn't do anything. She's an old woman. Are you okay, ma'am?" she called to Hattie. Keller turned his head, slow and deliberate. "Go inside. Go inside. Now. This doesn't concern you." She took a step back. Eyes wide, mouth half open, the words curling up and dying under the weight of authority weaponized. Brent turned back to his task. Hattie was silent now, lips parted in shock or pain, no one could tell. The metal beneath her arms shimmered with heat waves. Her breathing came in short, ragged bursts. Her shoulders heaved under the weight of age and restraint. She was still dressed for errands. Cotton blouse, sensible shoes, earrings small and neat, not a weapon on her, not even her voice. Keller stood over her like a statue cut from stone. No emotion, no hesitation. A man executing duty as if humanity were an optional setting. No Miranda rights, no stated charge, no backup. And then the silence shifted. Elise stepped into view. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She walked, measured and directed, like the moment had been waiting for her. No one saw where she came from. One second she wasn't there, and the next she was cutting through the heat like a blade. She didn't touch anyone. She didn't speak. Her presence was enough. Keller glanced up, momentarily thrown. Not scared, not intimidated, just check. Elise's eyes locked onto him like floodlights. There was no flinch in her, no pleading, no question. Her gaze held the kind of stillness that makes predators stop moving. It wasn't anger, it was judgment, rendered in absolute silence. Her face betrayed nothing. Her arms hung calmly by her side. But her eyes spoke volumes. Brent had never learned to read. He stepped back, not far, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. His hand twitched by his belt, a reflex with no purpose. He looked away first. The street remained silent. The girl at the driveway had vanished behind her door. Hattie was still bent over the hood, her body motionless now, save for the shuddering rhythm of shallow breath. Keller didn't uncuff her. He didn't help her up. He just stared back at Elise for a moment too long before muttering something indecipherable under his breath and turning toward his car. Elise didn't follow him with her eyes. She walked to Hattie instead. She knelt. She didn't touch the cuffs. She didn't speak, just knelt beside her, watching, breathing with her, matching rhythm, holding space. Keller slid back into his cruiser and shut the door with more force than necessary. The engine roared, the tires peeled. No ticket was issued, no record made. But the silence had teeth. The squad car was gone, but the burn marks stayed. It etched on Hattie's arms, on the hood, in the air. She didn't speak. Her eyes were open but fixed on nothing, her body rigid with a dignity too often mistaken for defiance. Elise stood beside her without reaching out, without dramatics. Her presence was not comforting. It was bearing witness, the kind of witnessing that turns heat into evidence and silence into indictment. Some neighbors peeked from their windows, blinds twitching, breath held. No one stepped out, not now, not after that. Minutes passed like lead. Finally, a local EMT vehicle pulled in. Slow, unsure, one of the techs jogged forward, then stopped short, seeing the woman standing by the car. Elise didn't move. She didn't introduce herself. She simply looked at him once, sharp, clinical, and he nodded like he'd received instructions spoken without sound. They uncuffed Hattie, carefully, with the gentleness people only remember when they're trying to erase what happened before. One of them winced when he saw the red skin on her arms. The other said nothing, but his hands trembled while checking her pulse. Elise stayed until Hattie was lifted onto the stretcher. She still hadn't spoken. She followed the gurney halfway to the ambulance, then stopped. Her eyes met Hattie's, not with pity, but a promise. The back doors closed. Elise turned and walked away. No badge, no announcement, just movement. She disappeared before anyone could ask her name. Across town, Officer Brent Keller sat in the precinct's break room, eating from a vending machine bag of pretzels like nothing had happened. His uniform was crisp, uncreased. His boots were polished. He scrolled his phone with his thumb, eyes flicking through news articles, messages, and one video snippet from someone across the street that had caught a sliver of his interaction with Hattie. He smirked. They never filmed the part where they look suspicious, he muttered to himself. Then, louder, to no one in particular, "Lady, match to description. Procedure." No one answered. A younger officer across the room glanced up, then down again. Another got up and left with his coffee half full. Keller leaned back in his chair, tossing a pretzel into his mouth. "Old people think they're untouchable," he said, voice casual. "That's the problem. No respect for chain of command." Someone scoffed behind him. He turned. No one was looking his way. He shook his head and returned to scrolling. Notifications buzzed. A tagged video. Another. The views are climbing. Still, he wasn't worried. Videos don't scare men like Keller. He had survived worse. Civilian complaints? Resolved. Lawsuits? Settled. Internal reviews? Redacted, sealed, gone. He knew the system, knew how the gears turned, and how easy it was to grind a few bones if the machine stayed running. He was smart enough to... What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this time the machine had taken notice. Not because Hattie Monroe was different, but because someone had been watching, and she wasn't here for a story. She was here for structure. Later that evening, the hood of his cruiser still warm from sunlight and arrogance, Brent pulled into his driveway. His house sat like every other in his neighborhood, neatly trimmed, square and indistinguishable. The kind of house is meant to reassure you that nothing dangerous ever happens here, that justice is a uniform, that wrong is a word you assign to the people who don't look like you. He parked, killed the engine, and checked his phone again. Messages are piling up now. A few supportive ones, from old buddies from the union rep. A few more are uncertain. One of his brothers just said, "Hey, call me. You good?" Brent didn't reply. Instead, he watched the video again, this time with sound. The silence in it is louder than any siren. The cough, the command, the quiver in Hattie's voice before it was crushed beneath orders. And then, those eyes. That woman, she hadn't spoken. That disturbed him more than anything. No argument, no protest, no camera in hand. Just eyes like steel shutters, locking him in. For a moment, Brent felt a tremor, not in fear, but in awareness. Something had shifted, not outside him, inside. He opened his front door, walked into the coolness of conditioned air, dropped his keys on the table, and went straight to the bathroom. Stared in the mirror, touched his badge. His reflection stared back, unbothered. But behind it, something waited, something watching. The street where it all began had returned to its illusion of calm. Children rode bicycles again. Lawns were watered, flags waved. But under it all, a pulse had started. Not loud, not visible, but constant. Ashmore Street would never look the same again to the people who had seen what they tried not to see. For the woman who had almost intervened, sleep would not come easily that night. Her keys would sit untouched on the kitchen counter, while she stared at her untouched dinner, replaying every second and asking herself why she hadn't done more. And somewhere in the city, Elise sat before a blank screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and then moved. Not to write a story, not to write a complaint, but to begin something else entirely. Something Brent Keller wouldn't see coming, because it wouldn't arrive with a siren. It would arrive in silence. The silence hadn't ended. It had only shifted form, from the smoldering hood of a cruiser to the cold circuits of a traffic surveillance camera mounted high above the street. Everything had been seen. Unblinking, mechanical, unbiased, the camera bore witness to what no one wanted to speak aloud. Captured the choke of heat rising from the metal, the flick of handcuffs locking onto trembling wrists, the way Brent Keller stood unflinching as an elderly woman collapsed against state-issued steel. No dialogue needed. The footage said enough, and for exactly 20 minutes, that footage existed on a public server, tagged anonymously under an innocuous log number. Then, without warning, it vanished, pulled, scrubbed, erased from the dashboard as if the event itself had been a passing hallucination. 20 minutes of accountability buried beneath technical review and data refresh, all without a trace of inquiry. But 20 minutes was enough. It always is, when one pair of eyes sees what others prefer to ignore. A student from the city college, parked across the intersection, had been recording the incident on his phone. He hadn't meant to. He wasn't an activist or a vigilante. He was just filming the sunset light on the whitewashed houses, testing his new stabilizer app. Then the cruiser swerved into frame. Then the old woman. Then the push. Then the cuffs. His hand didn't shake, not because he was brave, but because he couldn't yet comprehend what he was seeing. He uploaded the clip to TikTok without a caption. But someone else added a voiceover. She was just old, not armed. The clip exploded, not with fury, but with a quiet, appalled momentum. It wasn't the violence that drew people. It was the precision, the ease, the professional brutality disguised as order. It was how Hattie didn't scream, how the officer didn't blink. The comments weren't the usual digital scream fest. They were colder, more surgical. This wasn't fear. This was familiarity. He'd done this before. That woman didn't resist. She folded. Brent Keller saw the video between mouthfuls of reheated pizza in the precinct break room. His badge glinted under fluorescent light, his posture relaxed. Watching himself push a senior citizen into hot metal didn't stir him. He smirked, his lips curled upward with a practiced kind of disdain. That's what this is about? A grandma with a wheeze? Please. It's not like she had a weapon. His voice carried across the room, coated in sarcasm like grease on a diner counter. Try walking up on a real threat sometime. These soft kids wouldn't last 2 minutes in a real call. He laughed, sharp and humorless. No one joined in. The other officers in the room glanced at their coffee, their phones, and their paperwork. Not out of shame, not yet, just out of habit, when silence is safer than alignment. Keller kept talking. Men like him always did. Tick-tock justice, what a joke. His fingers flicked the screen again. Views climbing. His name is not mentioned, just the uniform, just the force. That's what shielded him, the anonymity of institutional violence, and he wore it like armor. Miles away, Elise sat in a room lit by a single wall of backlit monitors. No television, no distractions, just data, silent and structured. On one screen, the pulled camera feed, a ghost file retrieved before it was deleted. She hadn't hacked the system. She hadn't needed to. Elise didn't force the doors open. She found the ones they forgot to lock. She watched the footage once. No reaction. No tilt of the head, no furrow of the brow. Just the quiet tracking of her eyes following every movement on screen. Brent's hand on Hattie's shoulder. The snap of metal. The violent indifference. She isolated the clip, time-stamped it, and saved it. No post, no upload. No hashtags. The file name, 12:41 p.m. _ suppressed footage MP4. She copied it onto a drive, encrypted and duplicated, and slid the file into a directory labeled simply reference, not for release. Then, without looking away from the screen, she blinked once and triggered the smart lens overlay built into her glasses. The footage played again, silent, raw, damning, and she recorded it, not on the network, but straight into the embedded memory of her frames. It wasn't about having the footage, it was about owning the timeline. She leaned back. Her fingers tapped once on the desk, not as a nervous habit, but as punctuation. Each movement is deliberate. Each click is a declaration. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Brent's laughter echoed into the digital void like a dog barking into glass. He couldn't feel the tide shift because men like him never notice when the water changes temperature. They only notice when it's too late to swim. And still, Elise didn't strike. Not yet, because revenge is for the impatient. What she was building required patience, precision, and the discipline to let rot rise to the surface before extracting it completely. She closed the tab. The screen went black. Her reflection stared back, calm, sharp, unreadable. She whispered nothing. She moved on. But the system did not forget, and the silence was recording everything. The silence followed her as it always did, not behind her like a shadow, but ahead of her like a path cleared in advance. After the footage was saved and the noise of the world carried on with its hashtags and hashtags of hashtags, Elise moved, not with urgency, not with rage, but with the same terrifying stillness that made Brent Keller blink first. Her arrival at the hospital was as unannounced as her stare on Ashmore Street. The automatic doors opened, the air conditioning hissed. No one asked her anything. No one dared. The fluorescent hallway smelled of bleach and time. Nurses whispered around clipboards. Monitors beeped in rhythm like a choir of failing hearts. Elise walked straight past the nurses' station, straight down the hall toward the restricted wing, where they kept trauma patients under a veil of controlled mercy. Her badge wasn't needed. Her face was enough. Her silence said everything that protocol couldn't. Room 217, Hattie Monroe, the woman on the hood, now horizontal, surrounded by steel rails and quiet machines, tubes in her arms, pulse faint but holding. Elise stepped in and closed the door behind her. The click of the latch sounded like the closing of a vault. She didn't cry, she didn't gasp, she didn't ask how long. She already knew. Instead, she reached into the side pocket of her coat and pulled out a small pair of surgical scissors. She moved to the bedside, leaned over, and carefully lifted a strand of Hattie's graying hair, matted slightly, stained dark where the skin had broken at the temple. Blood had dried into it, brown and flaked. Elise trimmed a lock with precise care, not too much, not too little, just enough to remember what injustice costs in cellular currency. She wrapped the strand in black velvet, folding it like something sacred. The cloth was already prepared. She had brought it with her. Then she reached for Hattie's hand. Her fingers were cool, skin as soft, but thin like rice paper. Elise held it gently, no squeezing, no theatrics, just presence. Her lips moved once, the words barely audible. I'm here. Nothing more. Nothing that begged for comfort or signaled helplessness. Just a statement of fact, weightless and absolute. The machines continued their mechanical song. Elise let go, turned, and left. The corridor swallowed her again, but her pace didn't change, as if the world around her adjusted to her tempo, not the other way around. She exited through the staff elevator, silent, smooth. When the doors closed, she pulled out her phone, opened a secure app layered in quantum encryption, and authenticated herself using a biometric sequence. The interface shifted. She was no longer just Elise, she was granted access. No passwords, no third-party authorizations. She belonged to a level most people didn't know existed, not because of fame, not because of connections, but because she had earned every key in silence and fire. She entered a line of code, triggering a buried protocol. Account Ethra pronounced. L1, status, activated, clearance level, Luna 9. The screen flickered, then resolved. A new set of tabs opened. Federal Level Oversight Network, Embedded Archival Crawlers, Judiciary Pattern Matchers, Internal Ethics Watchdog Feeds. She moved through them like a pianist, hands exact, not rushed. Every click opened another vault, another layer of truth buried under procedural dust. She located a node, Officer Brent Keller. File status, active. Internal classification, blue alpha. Flagged entries, 0. Disciplinary actions, none. A lie. She tapped override, then deep pattern scan. The system buzzed, calculating intersections. Her eyes didn't blink, her breath stayed steady. She knew what she'd find. Before the report surfaced, she did something else. She opened a secondary tab, wrote a message with 6 words. No greeting, no signature, no explanation. You just arrested the wrong woman. She hit send. The recipient, keller.internal@region12.patrolnet.gov. Subject line, none. Encryption, ghost layered, untraceable. The cursor blinked once, then disappeared. She returned to the Keller node. The files had populated. She downloaded them, uncompressed the folder, and saw the index populate. Each document has a bruise. Each entry is a silent scream. She didn't read them. Not now. Instead, she opened a new case shell and gave it a title, Keller, pending. She dragged all relevant files into it, clicked Mark for pattern review, enabled cross-agency visibility. Then she paused. She moved the cursor to share, hovered, and didn't click. Not yet. Instead, she sat back, stared at the screen, and let the names and numbers etch into her mind. Not as painful, not as grief, but as coordinates, as a strategy, as chess pieces. Outside, the world spun. The internet fumed. The algorithms learned nothing. But within the hospital walls, within federal servers, within encrypted channels buried under mountains of indifference, something had begun to breathe, and Elysia didn't need to raise her voice to make it heard. The folder opened like a wound that had never closed. No fanfare, no cinematic alert, just a quiet cascade of folders, each one stamped with the kind of bureaucratic indifference that conceals rot behind polished glass. Elise leaned closer to the monitor, not because she needed to see, but because precision demanded proximity. Her fingers didn't shake, her posture didn't tense, but her presence in the room had shifted. This was not an investigation, this was an excavation. The first document blinked open, a civil complaint dated April 4, 2013. Subject, Officer Brent Keller. Nature of complaint, unlawful use of force during a standard traffic stop. Civilian, male, black, age 34. Outcome, internal review. Closure note, no misconduct determined. Stamp, closed. No internal settlement. The second came fast. June 17, 2014. A noise complaint escalated into a physical altercation. The woman sustained a fractured wrist. Photos attached. Brandt's report stated, subject became verbally aggressive, required physical compliance. No video, no disciplinary note. Closed. Internal settlement. The third was older, 2011. A child, age 9, was injured during a house raid. The file was thin, almost insultingly so. A single page with vague language. The injury was deemed incidental to the operational environment. Incidental. To whom? No follow-up, no compensation recorded. Closed. Internal settlement. One by one, they stacked. 14 civilian complaints. 3 separate notations for excessive force, each one dressed in passive language like armor, discrepancy in use of restraint protocol, potential misunderstanding during crowd control, unexpected outcome during compliance procedure. Every sentence bled with the language of denial by design. Every case ended with the same silent epitaph: closed, internal settlement. Elise scrolled without blinking. The screen glowed cool against her face. The air in the room was still, heavy, not with emotion, but with consequence. She didn't write notes. She didn't highlight lines. She didn't need to. Her eyes scanned the data like a blade being sharpened on steel. Then she found it, a handwritten memo, scanned poorly, edges faded, timestamp barely legible, from a field supervisor, dated October 2011. Line 3 underlined. Officer Brent Keller exhibits consistent threshold breaches when engaging minority individuals, recommends psychological evaluation. There was no follow-up memo, no confirmation of evaluation. The memo sat buried behind a folder named Staff Profiles, Historical. She opened the system's compression tool, not the one designed for ease, but the federal-level binary compressor, dragged every file into it, every PDF, every redacted image, every scan with corners torn or words smudged. The list was relentless, the timeline damning. She gave the archive a name: Keller_suppressed_patterns, GGPL. No subtitle, no summary, no call to action. The facts didn't need commentary. She closed the folder, right-click, moved it into a directory months ago, when she didn't yet know it would come to this. The directory name: evidence_needs_no_voice. She didn't share the file, not yet. She didn't send an email. She didn't draft a report. She simply watched the progress bar fill from 0 to 100%. When it finished, she sat back, exhaled once, controlled, shallow, final, not a breath of relief, a breath of readiness. Across town, Brent Keller laughed at a joke no one told, cocky as ever, wrapped in his mythology. But a file existed now, a file that didn't blink, didn't forget, didn't forgive, and it was waiting. The file sat motionless on her screen, quiet as a gun that hadn't been fired but already chosen its target. Elise stared at the name, Keller_suppressed_patterns PGL. Not like it was a piece of evidence, but like it was a blade she had forged herself, tempered not with anger but precision. She didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. The cursor hovered over attach file. One click, then another. First email, no subject, no greeting, no sign-off. It went to the Federal Investigations Oversight Board. The address wasn't public, but neither was she. She didn't need to ask for permission. She didn't care for a response. She only uploaded the file, encrypted it in military-grade layers, and sent it. Second email, Office of Ethical Conduct, internal, obscure, accessible only to credentialed personnel with access levels most have never heard of. She attached the same file. No body text, no disclaimers, no context. The message didn't ask to be understood, it only requires to be received. Third email, a private law firm known for one thing: strategic litigation against state misconduct. They didn't advertise, they didn't campaign, they operated in silence and burned through corruption like acid through iron. The file is attached, no instructions, no name, no subject. The action was the message. All 3 emails were sent in under 45 seconds, no errors, no lag, no follow-up. Then she reached for the phone. It wasn't the one on her desk. That one was for the surface-level world, the polite masks of routine identity. This phone lived inside a locked drawer, beneath a lined notebook and a sealed pouch of redundant SIMs. It was matte black, no branding. The signal was rerouted 6 times before the call even left the building. She entered the number manually. Every digit burned into her muscle memory. When the line clicked open, no one spoke. Elise waited 3 seconds, then said 5 words. Each one deliberates. Soft, lethal. Activate Protocol 7.9. The line cut itself before she could be asked why. Somewhere, servers hummed. Somewhere, flags rose in databases built to hide from daylight. Somewhere, procedures awakened procedures, so buried in legal subtext they were designed never to be mentioned out loud. Elise put the phone back. She opened her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and with a pen that bled black as a consequence, she wrote, "This is not revenge. This is the responsibility of a citizen." No underline, no decoration, just the sentence. She closed the book, locked the drawer, and stood. Across the city, Brent Keller leaned against a squad car and bit into a breakfast sandwich like nothing in the world could ever reach him. The morning was crisp, traffic light, sky impossibly blue. His laughter rang out between sips of gas station coffee as he swapped stories with another officer about nothing in particular. Then his radio crackled with a nonchalant dispatch. "Hey, Keller, someone from records called. Had some old stuff in your files getting flagged by an outside audit. You know anything about that?" Brent didn't miss a beat. He grinned. "Let me guess, another snowflake law clerk on a witch hunt? Tell him good luck finding anything that sticks. Internal cleared me on all that years ago." He laughed again. The sound was sour, dry, arrogant. "Tell records they better bring aspirin. Going through my file is like digging up a lion's den and hoping for flowers." He tossed the sandwich wrapper in the back seat and got into the car. The audit would mean nothing. It always meant nothing. They always came too late, looked too shallow, and asked the wrong questions. Brent Keller didn't just survive scrutiny, he devoured it. But what he didn't realize, what he would never understand until it was far too late, was that the audit wasn't the threat. The silence was. And silence, in the hands of someone like Elise, wasn't passive. It was programming. And the code had already been executed. The silence Brent had mocked no longer surrounded him, tunneled beneath him, laying mines. While he moved through days with the blind arrogance of someone who believed his past was a locked drawer, Elise was redrawing blueprints in real time. She didn't refresh the screens. She revived ghosts. Not one, many. The first came from 2011, a name barely remembered, no media coverage, no public outrage, just a death log. One homeless man, no known relatives. Expired at 3:14 a.m. in a district holding cell. No autopsy report scanned into the system, but one note buried in the physical archives. A maintenance request from that same night. Camera 4C, offline due to unknown technical fault. There were no backups. There were no questions. The body was cremated within 48 hours. The officer of record, Brent Keller. The second ghost was smaller, just 16. Name, withheld by sealed records. Arrested for loitering, no weapon, no warrant. Found kneeling in a public park with both hands behind his head while Keller shouted instructions not listed in any protocol. A cell phone video caught part of it before the officer blocked the lens. The boy was released. No charges. No public statement, no accountability. The footage lived 3 days online before being flagged and removed for community guideline violations. The pattern wasn't subtle. It wasn't even hidden. It had simply been allowed, covered in administrative dust, obscured by routine approval stamps and the apathy of rotating supervisors. But the moment Elise activated Protocol 7.9, cross-departmental silence fractured. What once had been quarantined in isolated cases now aligned like stars in a burned-out sky. There it was, file code K14, a psychological risk marker used internally by the department to flag officers exhibiting repeated signs of aggression, particularly when racial bias was suspected but unproven. The marker was advisory only, not enforceable, and often ignored. In Keller's file, it had been flagged twice. Both times were overruled by a supervisory override labeled justified intensity under field stress. Then came the resignation letter, handwritten, scanned, filed under voluntary exits. One line stood out, etched in looping ink from someone who wrote it with a shaking hand. I can no longer justify staying silent while a colleague turns procedure into punishment. I leave not because I'm weak, but because I refuse to be used as a shield. Elise didn't blink. She took out a fresh sheet of tracing paper, not digital. She wanted this physical, tactile irrevocable. She began to draw, not a map, not a timeline, a network, arcs, links, dots, names. Every buried incident became a node. Every timestamp is a pulse. At the center of it all, one name circled 3 times in red: Brent Keller. Not a mistake, not an isolated flaw in judgment, not a single bad moment under pressure. He was not a man with a past. He was the past. Weaponized, protected, replicated. She pinned the network to the board. The silence around her didn't murmur. It roared. She traced the links in silence, her pen moving like a scalpel across the surface of buried truth. The network diagram grew, not in complexity, but in clarity. There were no extra lines, no decoration, only names, dates, consequences, and the black mass at the center, Brent Keller. She didn't circle him again. She didn't need to. The weight of connection spoke louder than any symbol. One name connected to too many incidents. Too many voids in documentation, too many missing seconds in surveillance logs, and censored civilian statements. These weren't coincidences, these were signatures. There was the precinct memo from 2015, barely legible due to a printer malfunction, citing a pattern of heightened aggression during civilian interactions from an unnamed officer. The context was blurred, but the timestamp placed it precisely 24 hours after Brent had restrained a pregnant woman face down in a church parking lot. That footage was gone too. Camera 7B corrupted during firmware update. She cross-checked resignation records. There it was again. A detective, female, Latino, who had served 10 years without blemish, abruptly stepping down with only 5 words filed under reason for exit. This isn't what I signed for. No investigation was ever opened. Brent was promoted 2 months later. There were timelines where his name disappeared, strategically, suspiciously absent from high-risk assignments, only to reappear in debrief summaries as supporting personnel. His fingerprints were everywhere, except where accountability lived. Elise didn't summarize. She didn't interpret. She compiled. Her system screen now held over 72 files, each tied to a different victim, complaint, or procedural gray zone. She didn't search for guilt. She plotted gravity. Wherever Keller went, the center of violence stabilized around him. Others rotated out. He remained calm, efficient, professional, and underneath it all, consistently unchallenged. That was no accident. She created a new timeline overlay, synchronizing Keller's duty logs with public reports of escalation. One pattern emerged immediately. Whenever oversight increased in one district, Keller would be reassigned. Not punished, not reprimanded, relocated. He was not isolated from power, he was maintained by it. The haunting detail wasn't what had been filed, but what had been deliberately left out. Every use of force complaint showed inconsistencies in timestamps. Every supervisory review ended in the same vague phrasing, no breach of conduct detected. Elise flagged 12 instances where statements were altered within 72 hours of submission. Her tools tracked the metadata. The changes were made by internal administrators, not field officers. She created another map. This time, the nodes weren't victims, they were enablers. The screen grew darker. She didn't smile. She didn't rage. She simply coded them with color. Red for direct perpetrators, yellow for suppressors, gray for ghosts, those who had left the force, resigned, retired, vanished into procedural fog. But none of them were free from the lattice. Brent sat at the intersection of every strand. He wasn't just a threat, he was an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't collapse when confronted. They collapse when exposed. Elise printed the entire web, plotted it, stacked it, filed it beneath a new folder with no name on the tab. She knew the system wouldn't open because of outrage. It would open when the data made closure impossible. She began building the compression for a public archive, an open-source data vault, to be scheduled, not published yet, not until the right lever turned. Brent Keller, meanwhile, remained oblivious. He filed reports, drank coffee, held briefings, took shifts, mocked whispers, believed himself too embedded to fall. His laughter still echoed in back rooms, his cruelty passed off as tough love. But now, in corridors he couldn't name, Behind eyes he hadn't noticed, the outline of his empire was being traced in silence, and it would not be confronted, it would be dismantled, systematically, with no warning, no press release, no dramatic reveal. Just one day, a lever would shift and the structure would fail, not from force, but from rot. And Elise, she would not be there to witness it, because her work would be done. The architecture of collapse was in place, but before the first crack showed on the surface, Elise planted a seed where no sirens ever reached, inside the minds of those who still believed in systems without seeing their skeletons. She didn't speak, she wrote, anonymously, not to provoke, not to confess, but to surgically insert doubt into a world drunk on procedure. The blog appeared without fanfare, no signature, no banner, just a plain white background and black serif font. The title, stark and quiet. Discipline is a matter of design. The first line was a whisper. When he shoved my mother into metal, I chose not to scream. No context, no name, no timestamp, just the truth, unadorned, weaponized by restraint. She wrote the rest like someone slicing paper with a scalpel, measured, precise, and with zero tolerance for melodrama. The post was not emotional. It was cold, too cold. That's what made it viral among people who never posted anything. Lawyers read it in full. Analysts flagged it as a rare example of systemic indictment without noise. Legislators passed it around back channels like contraband, their hands trembling not from outrage but from recognition. The core of the post wasn't what had happened. It was the theses underneath. That violence is not a failure of control, but the success of design. That some uniforms are stitched not to serve, but to dominate. That silence is not complicity, but a weapon more precise than outrage. I did not raise my voice, she wrote, because I wasn't trying to be heard. I was reprogramming what gets listened to. Her final sentence carved its place in the minds of readers like a verdict etched in stone. I did not choose to argue face to face. I chose to restructure the system you stand on. It was unlike anything Brent Keller had read before. He didn't even know why it had landed in his inbox. An anonymous tip, a shared link. Some intern is probably trying to stir trouble. He skimmed it at first, then scrolled slower, then stopped entirely, his jaw set. Not in rage, in something colder, because he knew. He didn't know the author, but he knew the tone. He had heard it before, in her eyes. The woman who never said a word. The one who looked at him like she was already reading his obituary. He told himself it was a coincidence, that it was just another attention-seeking blog post, but it felt like standing in a spotlight that no one else could see, like being watched through layers of glass while everyone else saw only the frame. He didn't talk about it, not to colleagues, not to his wife, not to the mirror. But the next morning, when he passed a group of officers laughing in the hallway, he couldn't help but wonder if the laughter had changed, if they were laughing near him or at him, if they knew something he didn't. End of poem. He checked his inbox again that night, refreshed it twice. There was nothing new, but the silence, it was loud. Elise didn't respond to the comments that poured into the blog's anonymous inbox. She never even opened them. That space was not for discourse. It was a scalpel's edge, not a stage. She logged out after the post went live and never returned. The piece had served its purpose the moment it began circulating inside encrypted legislative group threads and digital legal digests, the kind read only by those who knew which gears mattered and how slowly they turned. Within 48 hours, a senator's aide forwarded it to a judge, who sent it to a retired ethics commissioner, who flagged it in a private briefing on policing standards. By the end of the week, a paragraph from the Post had been quoted, without attribution, in an internal roundtable on law enforcement accountability. Elise's voice, unclaimed and invisible, had entered the bloodstream of reform not by request, but by infection. It spread not because it shouted. It spread because it couldn't be argued with. Every sentence was airtight. Every line is constructed to corner the reader into agreement before they even notice. It didn't name departments. It didn't accuse individuals, it indicated blueprints, not builders. And yet, anyone with eyes and access to a few suppressed documents knew exactly who it was about, Brent Keller included. He didn't admit it to himself out loud, but the article had dug into him like a thorn that refused to rot or heal. He told himself the paranoia was just a symptom of being under watch again. It wasn't the first time. He'd been scrutinized before, always passed through, always untouched, but this time the air felt different. The looks felt calibrated. The laughter didn't stop when he entered the room. It just shifted pitch. The hallway banter grew quieter when he got too close. His phone buzzed less. His name was no longer at the top of the patrol rosters. Subtle things, tiny things, nothing you could quote, everything you could feel. He caught his reflection in the dark window of his cruiser one night. He looked like himself, clean, firm, composed, but something about the eyes, the angle, the way the light fell. For the first time, it didn't look like a man with power. It looked like a man being studied. He began checking every monitor feed he passed, looking for signs his access had changed. He double-checked the doors he once walked through freely. No one stopped him, no one confronted him, but protocols had shifted in whispers. The code still worked, but only just. And that was the brilliance of what Elise had done. She hadn't thrown a brick. She had recalibrated the walls around him until they no longer supported his weight. She didn't need to drag him out. She just made sure gravity no longer worked in his favor. In her private notebook, bound in matte gray with no name and no pages numbered, she wrote only one line after the blog was published. Not a victory lap, not a confession, just the final verdict before the verdict. The villain was sentenced the moment he believed himself untouchable. She closed the book, not slowly, not dramatically, just firmly, with the kind of finality no applause could follow. Brent, alone in his living room that evening, turned off the television. His wife had gone to bed early. His phone was face down on the table, screen off. He sat there in the silence, staring forward. He didn't blink for several minutes. Something in his chest tightened. Not fear, not guilt, something worse. Recognition. He didn't know who was watching. He didn't know where the attack would come from. But for the first time in his career, he realized someone was not trying to fight him. They were dismantling him. And he didn't know how to stop something that never shouted, only moved, like a shadow, like history, like a verdict that had already been written. When silence had done its job, and Brent Keller had begun to sweat in places he used to strut, Elise moved not with noise, but with memory. Not all revenge burns hot. Some freeze over the years, then strike like frostbite. Quiet, sudden, irreversible. 15 years earlier, she had stood at the corner shelf of the university library, thumbing through a faded hardcover about jurisprudence and ethics, her backpack half-zipped, her ID clipped visibly to her collar. She remembered the weight of the room that day, not the silence of scholars, but the static in the air before something wrong announced itself without warning. Brent Keller had entered with the entitlement of a man who believed his badge was an extension of divine will, not public service. His eyes skimmed the room once, then settled on her like a searchlight that had already decided it had found guilt. "You!" he barked, loud enough to shatter the sanctity of a space built for thought. "Put the book down, step back, hands out. No probable cause, no question, no context. Just that look in his eyes, hollow confidence dressed as authority." She complied, not because she feared him. She feared the system that had trained him to look at people like her and assume theft before thought. He dragged her toward the checkout desk, spun her around, and pushed her against the scanner pedestal like it was a booking station. "Tripped the RFID, he muttered, even though it hadn't beeped. "Looks like you forgot to check that out, huh?" His voice curled into a smirk that didn't need to show. He didn't search her bag. He didn't call a librarian. He just stood there, smirking, as if pinning down a young black woman was justice in its most natural form. She remembered the laughter of a student behind her, sharp, nervous, obedient. That single incident shattered the trajectory she'd built with surgical precision. Ivy League scholarship revoked. Disciplinary warning issued. Academic trust erased. No one cared for her record, her GPA, or her spotless reputation. One accusation from Keller weighed more than 4 years of effort. Her appeals went nowhere. The university's legal team wrapped it up with clean administrative language, unable to find misconduct by the officer involved, and when she filed a complaint, a formal, federal, fireproof packet of grievance and documentation, she received a one-line rejection. Officer Keller has no record of misconduct. Case closed. The file returned to her 2 weeks later, not by mail, hand-delivered, folded with disrespect, no envelope, just creased paper and contempt. And on the last page, her signature, her name in ink, the last remnant of her stamp, had been violently smeared, a heavy stroke of black marker slashed across it like censorship, like erasure. She didn't cry. Instead, she turned the page over, flipped the mutilated paper to its bare white back, and wrote a single line across it. "The day you buried me, you didn't know I was a seed." That moment was no breakdown. It was a blueprint. Brent Keller never remembered her. She was just another face in a long line of people he labeled, handled, and subdued. To him, it was Tuesday. To her, it was the day her future was set on fire, and she learned how to walk through it. Not away, through. The name Elise Monroe disappeared from academic registries, but it burned quietly behind layers of data systems and encrypted access keys. She worked under initials. She rebuilt under aliases. Her degrees came from elsewhere, less prestigious, more brutal. She didn't wear her education like a medal, she wore it like armor. What Keller failed to understand, and what most men like him never do, is that violence does not always leave bruises. Sometimes it leaves codes, scripts, access rights, and the woman he thought he had reduced to a possible suspect would one day be the one typing commands that unlocked every skeleton he had stuffed behind institutional silence. He had marked her once. She marked him back, not with ink, but with records. 15 years was enough time for dust to settle on broken dreams, for wounds to turn into muscle, and for silence to sharpen into weaponry. Elise never needed to scream. She didn't need headlines or protest signs or interviews. She only needed to remember, precisely, surgically, without mercy. She remembered the cold tone of the police report that refused her, no evidence of bias or misconduct found. She remembered how the university had chosen its relationship with law enforcement over the future of one student. She remembered every folder, every official who smiled and offered condolences laced with complicity. She remembered, and because she remembered, she rebuilt. The girl in the library had been stripped of opportunity. The woman in front of the monitor now possessed access few ever touched. She didn't rage, she architected. She didn't accuse, she revealed. She didn't ask for justice, she extracted it, bite by bite, entry by entry. And Brent Keller, in all his bloated confidence, had long forgotten the student he shoved against a wooden desk for no reason. But the system never forgets, not when someone learns how to make it remember. The badge he wore had shielded him from consequence, but badges rust, systems crash, and memories, when weaponized by the right hands, resurrect everything buried under years of bureaucratic dirt. He thought she'd vanish. She did, into code, into paper trails, into systems, into shadows, not to disappear, but to reappear when it mattered most. Because Elise Monroe was never a victim. She was a sleeper system in the making, and 15 years later, the file with her redacted name no longer sat in a drawer. It burned like a beacon across every screen that mattered. She didn't survive injustice, she outdid it. The echo of memory had barely faded when the present began to buckle. Elise didn't wait for applause or vindication. She didn't need either. Her war was not emotional. It was systemic, surgical. And now it reached the highest tables, where decisions were dressed in suits and sealed in silence. The council, an internal body once built to shield reputation rather than serve truth, was the next domino, and it was already leaning. Inside the ivory-tinted walls of the oversight board, someone finally flinched. The digital audit returned red flags, not in data, but in its absence. Dozens of entries within Brent Keller's personnel file had been overwritten, stripped of substance, replaced by bland placeholders that reeked of sanitized cover-ups. Entry Unavailable code SA 4.3 repeated like a broken mantra, but someone finally read between those hollow lines and dared to say it aloud. The file had been bleached, not lost, not corrupted, bleached, intentionally, precisely, and with access that required internal authority. What once had been evidence of misconduct was now a graveyard of gaps. The forensic tech didn't speak in outrage, printed, quietly, laid the papers on the long table. No one shouted, no one gasped. The chairman looked down at the ghosted entries and did what cowards in power do when faced with the stench of rot. He hesitated. But not everyone in that room had hollow spines. One councilwoman, older with a long scar across her left hand, earned from a protest she refused to leave decades ago, slid the annual ethics compliance report across the table and said, without raising her voice, "I will not sign this, not if Keller isn't reopened for review." No debate followed, just the quiet sound of her pen being capped and set aside, like a sword returned to its sheath. Across the room, a junior analyst stared at the floor, clutching a hard drive like it was radioactive, because it was. The files on it, decrypted just hours before, contained internal memos, time-stamped edits, and a smoking string of user access logs, all tracing back to a specific authorization key used repeatedly over 7 years, a key tied directly to the deputy chief's office. The storm didn't break with thunder. It spread in whispers and refusals. A memo leak, an internal bulletin never meant to leave the 4th floor, made its way to 3 inboxes it shouldn't have. Its subject line was a dagger disguised as an afterthought. If Keller remains untouched, we lose moral command. The body of the message wasn't legalese or a warning. It was surrender, a quiet admission that they'd looked the other way for too long, and the floor beneath them had started to crack. Brent Keller still walked into the regional command office like he owned it. His boots clicked across marble floors, polished to reflect power, not conscience. He reached for the door, nodded at the receptionist, and expected the usual bored gesture toward the executive wing. Instead, the security lock didn't blink. The receptionist looked up, not with fear, but with discomfort, and said, "You're not on the calendar today." His brow twitched. "I don't need to be. Tell Novak I'm here." But the phone stayed untouched. "I'm sorry, Officer Keller. You'll need to schedule through internal channels." That was the first freeze. Not denial, distance. The kind of sterile corporate rejection that doesn't scream, just vanishes your access like you were never real. He stormed out, dialed an internal extension. Voicemail. Tried again. Voicemail. When he reached the council's administrative liaison, the call was declined before the second ring, and that was the moment Brent Keller, arrogant, armored, untouchable, understood something unspoken but unmistakable. Someone had made him radioactive. Elise didn't gloat. She didn't appear. She didn't have to. Her presence arrived in the form of a single LAR email, sent to every member of the Oversight Council at exactly 8:00 AM, time-stamped and traceable. The subject field was blank. The body contained 10 words. "Inaction is complicity. I trust you know what that means." No signature, no attachments, just a consequence. That line wasn't a threat. It was a spotlight, and under its glare, no one wanted to be seen sitting beside Keller. Within 48 hours, the council began issuing procedural clarifications. They didn't say his name, not yet, but they revoked the backdated commendations. They froze his pending promotion to field trainer, and in a move so rare it required 3 overlapping authorizations, they reopened his 2011 incident under the category of ethical malfeasance, with potential racial bias. The wording was cold, clinical, but it rang louder than any indictment. Council documents weren't theatrical. They were devastating in their restraint. A single line changed history. Prior assessments determined to be incomplete due to administrative omissions. In legal parlance, it was an admission of guilt without apology. In power structures, it was a blueprint for collapse. Brent tried to rally allies. He sent private messages. None replied. He showed up unannounced at precincts where he'd once been hailed. The front desk buzzed security before letting him in. Even his oldest colleague, a man who once toasted Brent's wedding, left him on read. Power, he realized, isn't loyalty, it's currency, and his had been devalued overnight. The walls weren't closing in. They had already closed. What remained was silence, not the kind that protected him, but the kind that observed him, dispassionate, clinical, absolute. Elise watched none of it unfold through surveillance or news. She didn't need to. Her silence was already operating like a scalpel, cutting through the tissue of excuse, exposing the nerves of institutional rot. She didn't issue follow-ups, didn't remind anyone. Her message had arrived like a knife, sharp, clean, and permanent. And the board, for all its prior cowardice, moved not because they believed in justice, but because they feared being tied to a sinking name. In power politics, survival always trumps allegiance. The signatures began disappearing. First one, then another. Electronic approval stamps were withdrawn. Committee chairpersons recused themselves from prior endorsements. By week's end, the Keller file, once sealed tight under layers of bureaucratic wax, was split open by a vote of necessity. No hand was raised, no voice spoke against it, just a quiet round of digital approvals, green checkmarks stacking like a slow, silent execution. They didn't expel Brent Keller. They unmade him, one decision at a time. They didn't drag him out. That would have made it easier to feel like a victim. Instead, they stripped him in layers, precisely, procedurally, and without sympathy. Brent Keller stood in the precinct he once ruled like a fortress, only to find his badge removed not with fury, but with formality. The commander didn't look him in the eye. He didn't need to. Paperwork did the heavy lifting now. A memo stamped in gray ink read, "Immediate suspension, effective 7 o'clock, subject to review, pending investigation." No headlines, no dramatic arrest, just a quiet vanishing of privilege. His gun was placed in a lockbox, his badge, number 2876, slid across a desk and into a drawer that didn't belong to him anymore. It clicked shut with the sound of finality. Keller didn't speak, because arrogance doesn't have vocabulary for slow collapse. He reached for a rationale, but there was none left. The office he once moved through like a wolf now reacted to him like a ghost. Eyes avoided his, conversations paused as he passed. Respect didn't dissolve. It inverted, became discomfort, became silence, became distance. He was radioactive, and everyone knew. One junior officer whispered, "He's done," not with venom, but with relief. Across town, the chief of police stood behind a podium, flanked by American flags and institutional regret. He called it an unfortunate misalignment of conduct and policy. He used words like accountability, review, and public trust, but he never once said the name Elise Monroe. Not because he didn't know it, but because speaking her name would have meant admitting that the entire framework had been cracked by someone outside the chain of command, someone they could neither predict nor control. So they spoke around her, like thunder trying to ignore the lightning. Keller watched that press conference alone. No family, no allies. The broadcast flickered across a flat screen in the break room, and he stood still, arms crossed too tightly, jaw twitching with the effort of containment. The chief's voice was sterile, his apology rehearsed. He wasn't protecting Keller anymore. He was protecting the institution from what Keller had become, liability. Later that day, Brent received a private summons. No email, no letter. A call, short and cold. "Command wants to see you. Now." He walked into the office, expecting a slap on the wrist, a scolding maybe, some plea for optics. Instead, the deputy commissioner, eyes like polished steel, said 5 words: "Step down or face charges." No performance, no legalese, just a choice. And for the first time in his career, Brent didn't know what came next. He wasn't being warned, he was being discarded. They were offering him a window, not out of kindness, but containment. If he walked now, they'd bury the noise. If he didn't, he'd go down with every file that had ever been scrubbed in his name. The silence that followed wasn't suspense, it was sentence. He sat in his car for over an hour after that meeting. hands on the wheel, unmoving. The dashboard ticked. The sun dipped. Somewhere behind his temples, the illusion of control finally cracked, not with rage, but with something worse. Doubt. He had no idea who was behind this unraveling. He thought maybe it was the media, then maybe the council, maybe politics, but none of those forces moved like this. None struck without seeking credit. This felt orchestrated, silent, perfect. That's when the video came. No intro. No preamble, just a black screen that shifted to an image. Elise Monroe, still, composed. No background noise, eyes locked on the lens like she was watching through it. Her voice came low, exact, clean as a scalpel. Silence doesn't mean I can't speak. I just wait until the right people have no choice but to listen. That was it, 15 seconds. Then the screen went black. Brent didn't drop the phone. He didn't hurl it across the seat. He sat frozen, knuckles pale, heartbeat erratic, a man unarmored for the first time in his life. That voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was something worse. It was inevitable. She didn't threaten. She didn't plead. She simply confirmed the reality he had refused to see. The game was never his. Not anymore. For years he had operated like consequences were someone else's burden. Every shove, every silence, every bruise left off record had been tucked neatly into the folds of a system designed to preserve its rot. But rot spreads. And now it had reached him, not with riots or protests, but with receipts, names, logs, chains of access and records reassembled by a woman he hadn't even remembered humiliating. Brent Keller wasn't losing his job. He was losing his illusion. And the worst part, he didn't even know her endgame. Because Elise didn't speak in courtrooms or news feeds. She moved through data, through law, through fear. She didn't demand apologies. She rerouted careers. She didn't want credit. She wanted to collapse. Strategic, precise, cold as the room that handed him a choice between erasure or exposure. She wasn't a whistleblower. She was a force of realignment. And in that silence, Brent finally understood that fear wasn't the absence of control. It was the realization that you were never in control at all. He stayed in that car until night swallowed the sky. No badge, no gun, just the weight of a name he had forgotten, now engraved into the downfall of his own. And somewhere, in a quiet office with no spotlight and no crowd, LES closed her laptop. One window closed. Another opened. The system had heard her, and from now on, it would speak in her language. The silence had done its damage. The badge was gone. The mask had cracked. But Elise didn't stop at dismantling one man. That was never the point. Brent Keller wasn't the disease. He was a symptom, and symptoms, once exposed, are only valuable if they lead to a cure. So she pivoted, not with vengeance, but with precision. Not toward Brant's throat, but toward the very bedrock that had protected it for years. She didn't knock on courtroom doors. She rewired the hinges. There was no public statement, no social media blitz, just a quiet message sent through encrypted channels to a network of civil rights attorneys, known for handling what other firms deemed too loaded to touch. These were lawyers who didn't wear pinstripes. They wore burn marks from battles waged in policy, class action, and institutional warfare. Elise gave them everything: evidence, patterns, timestamps, the buried internal logs, the internal settlements masked as procedural closures. But most importantly, she gave them structure. She didn't want a headline. She wanted architecture, legal scaffolding that would survive long after the cameras left. The case wasn't filed against Brent Keller as a man. It was filed against the machine that made him inevitable. The suit bore a name that carried no emotion, just indictment. Citizens versus the framework of institutional shielding. But inside its pages, the truth burned like a flare. Names of victims, dates of misconduct, incidents repeated with surgical similarity. The filing didn't read like a grievance. It read like a war plan. 3 former victims, men and women who once wore scars Keller assumed no one would notice, stepped into the light. They weren't polished. They weren't coached. They didn't rehearse. They stood in a sterile white law office, signed their declarations, and launched the first coordinated legal offensive against not just a man, but a precinct, a department, a pattern. None of them had ever met Elise, but each of them, separately, had found her fingerprints in their files, meticulously preserved, linked, annotated. Her silence had not been just recorded, it had been restored. The suit demanded $28 million 0 cents in reparations, a number that wasn't chosen for drama, it was surgical, large enough to shake the city budget, small enough to signal strategy, not performance. Every dollar represented a truth they couldn't bury, a receipt for silence bought and now returned. But Elise didn't just fund the legal team, she had also coded the digital infrastructure behind it. The complaint wasn't just physical. It lived online in a secure mirror data vault, publicly accessible the moment the case hit the clerk's desk. Keller watched the press scramble to digest the story, but what rattled him wasn't the content, it was the composition. The suit was airtight. No leaks, no grandstanding, no dramatic headlines. It came like a storm buried in fog. Before anyone could rally to suppress it, the filings had been time-stamped, archived, and locked across 6 legal jurisdictions. His first call to a city lawyer went unanswered. The second one responded, "I'm no longer representing matters connected to you." It wasn't fear, it was abandonment. The most brutal detail? The quote that ended the filing. Typed, centered, no bold font, just clean and lethal. "I do not break walls. I let them fall. Once, no one remains willing to hold them up." Monroe. No signature, no author cited, but the initials spoke volumes. It wasn't just a statement, it was a principle. Nonviolent demolition by absence of support. Elise didn't attend any legal hearings. She didn't need to. She watched from the back end of a closed-loop analytics panel, tracking mentions, reactions, and depositions. Not to interfere, to monitor the system doing what it should have done a decade ago. She wasn't a plaintiff, she was an architect. Her hands were off the lever, but the lever still turned. In legal offices across the district, partners held closed-door meetings. They reviewed insurance policies, braced for settlements, and questioned internal affiliations. City attorneys scrubbed conflict of interest disclosures. HR departments opened dormant complaint lines, hoping too late to preempt the next spark. The suit had not only struck, it had exposed. Brent Keller, meanwhile, became a footnote, not a person of interest, just a node, an artifact. The filings treated him like the consequence of a failed system, not the center of one. And that burned deeper than any personal accusation. He wasn't even the villain anymore, he was evidence. The media struggled to spin it. There was no footage, no protest, just documents, dates, and a story told in thousands of lines of unretracted fact. The plaintiffs didn't cry. They pointed, and when asked if they wanted to confront Keller, one of them replied, "What for? He's already been forgotten by the system that made him." Elise stayed in the background. She moved funds through third-party accounts. She rerouted data flow through proxies. She didn't want the spotlight. She wanted structure. This wasn't justice served. This was a precedent established. Case law. Policy redefinition, a ripple disguised as a signature. Somewhere in the city, a low-level clerk handling filings paused at the end of the suit, reading the final quote again. She didn't know Elise, she didn't know Keller, but for a moment she understood the brilliance of it all, how one woman had built a legal grenade and thrown it without noise, without credit, without needing to watch it explode, because the damage was already coded. The filing was public, the evidence undeniable, and the machine had been named. But paper alone doesn't collapse empires. Consequences do. And for Brent Keller, they arrived not as a sudden landslide, but as a sequence of sharp, precise failures, each one severing another tie to the illusion of untouchability he'd wrapped himself in for decades. The man who once barked orders now found himself standing in silence while systems he once controlled recalibrated to erase him. One login denied, one favor unreturned, one phone call unanswered. The first fracture came quietly, with numbers. The bank that had once welcomed him with priority lines and handshake loans froze all personal and joint accounts linked to his name. The order was procedural, nothing personal, just a preemptive freeze pending litigation exposure connected to the class action suit now gaining momentum in federal court. No drama, just a call he didn't receive, followed by a declined transaction at a gas station, then another at the grocery store. When he finally reached a customer service line, the voice on the other end said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Keller. Due to pending liability risk, your accounts are under review. Please refer to your legal counsel." He had none. The house, his suburban fortress of brick and badge pride, became the next casualty. Legal counsel fees began to stack with compound vengeance, and in a matter of weeks the title deed was used as collateral to avoid full asset seizure. His wife didn't yell, she didn't cry. She simply walked into the living room one morning, placed a manila envelope on the table and said, "I've filed for legal separation. You'll need to sign these before the preliminary hearing." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The silence between them had fermented for months. His disgrace wasn't a surprise. It was overdue. What stung most wasn't the legal language or the property lines being redrawn. It was the look in her eyes. Not hate, not pity, but distance. Like he was a portrait she no longer recognized hanging on a wall that wasn't hers anymore. The newspaper article came 2 days later. Local press, front page, no special font, just sharp truth bleeding into ink. The headline read, "When a badge can no longer hide the man." The article didn't speculate, it cited. It quoted filings, testimony, and statistical patterns. It ended not with a question, but a certainty. Public safety cannot be defined by those who hide behind silence and expect immunity in return. The photo was brutal, not a mugshot, not a staged press release. Just Brent, mid-step outside a municipal building, face twisted, eyes dodging, as if reality had chased him into the daylight. At his son's school, the administration sent an internal memo banning the press from campus grounds, but it didn't stop the whispers. Children hear what adults pretend to conceal. The boy came home quiet, then came home crying. "Why did they say my dad hurt people?" he asked once, in a voice too small for a question so big. Brent didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, because the truth had turned to ash in his mouth. A father can't lie when the world has already told the child what the mirror refused to. The boy stopped wearing anything with his last name stitched into it. The playground became a courtroom with no rules. Brent's son returned home bruised, not from fists, but from isolation. The cruelest blows came as laughter, exclusion, and glances. Not one child said the word monster, but they didn't have to. The silence said enough. One parent, trying to be diplomatic, asked the principal if it would be possible to have the boy transferred for his emotional safety. The irony stung harder than any headline. Brent stood outside the courthouse one Thursday afternoon, phone pressed to his ear, sun baking the sidewalk, cars passing without pause. He called the only lawyer he thought still owed him a favor. No answer. He tried another, and another. The sixth call was picked up, but the line went dead after he spoke his name. He stood frozen, surrounded by a world that now moved around him like he didn't belong in it. A man once feared, now a man avoided. He lowered the phone, stared into the sky with the dull stare of someone waking from a very long lie, and mumbled, half to himself, half to the shadows of a system that no longer saluted him, "I was just doing my job." But the job was never the problem. It was how he wore it like armor, how he weaponized it like a license, how he confused authority with absolution. The system had fed him that myth. He had believed it. Now it was feeding on itself, and he was the first to be devoured. No one shouted, no one chased him down with cameras. His downfall came with silence, documents, and the shifting of chairs in boardrooms that no longer had space for his name. And in that silence, what withered wasn't just reputation, it was belonging. Every favor is gone, every contact is dry, every legacy is rotting from the inside out. Brent Keller wasn't bankrupt financially, not yet, but his honor, that account had long since overdrawn. Now, the world was simply collecting the interest. The silence Brent had once wielded like a weapon now wrapped around him like a noose. Isolation was no longer a media problem or a courtroom strategy. It was institutional, intimate, slow burning. It started not with punishment, but with absence. Not with protest, but with quiet departures, perfectly timed and surgically damning. The men who had once stood beside him, those who laughed at his cruelty, nodded through his shortcuts and looked the other way when rules bent under his boots, began to disappear, not with noise, with statements. 3 veteran officers, each with over 2 decades of service, submitted resignation letters within 72 hours of each other, not redacted, not vague, signed in full, dated, filed publicly. Each one contained the same final sentence: "I will not stand beside the humiliation of justice." The precinct didn't make a statement. It didn't have to. Their departure was louder than sirens. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Offices were cleared with minimal conversation, lockers emptied, name tags removed, but the absences echoed through the hallways like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Each departure was a statement of dissociation, not from the job, but from Brent. They didn't cite him by name, but they didn't have to. Everyone understood what they meant. He was the rot they refused to inhale anymore. One of them had been Brent's loudest defender, a man who once called him a hammer for the nails this city tries to ignore. That same man gave a press briefing outside the precinct, short, sharp, and final. "There is no law above human decency. I stayed too long pretending there was." Then he walked away, not just from the job, but from every inch of legacy he'd once shared with Brent. The most brutal crack didn't come from resignation. It came from revelation. A video surfaced, one buried deep in a 2016 misconduct archive, recorded by a civilian who had been too afraid to release it until now. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Brent Keller standing over a pregnant black woman during a routine traffic stop, voice dripping with disdain as he barked, "If you want respect, stop breeding entitlement." The clip was short, less than 20 seconds, but it burned through the public consciousness like acid. No denials, no edits, just one long, continuous moment of undeniable degradation. That footage alone would have destroyed a rookie. For Brent, it detonated the last thread of plausible defense. The footage wasn't shocking because it was rare. It was shocking because it fit. It confirmed everything that had been murmured, accused, documented, but ignored. It made his silence guilty. It made his bravado grotesque. The internet didn't rage. It dissected, frame by frame, word by word, legacy by legacy. The Office of Internal Affairs moved swiftly, not out of conscience, but out of necessity. With public pressure boiling and private funding threatened, they issued a formal recommendation. Brent Keller's commendations, service medals, and citations of excellence would be rescinded retroactively, struck from the record, and erased from the department's Hall of Honor. Not one name objected. The motion passed unanimously. His career didn't die, it was voided. Inside the department's central archive, a clerk entered his personnel file with gloves and a scanner. She didn't make eye contact with him when he walked past. She only keyed in a deletion code, clicked confirm, and moved on to the next name. No fanfare, no ceremony, just erasure. Elise watched none of this unfold on television. She didn't need headlines or commentary. She only glanced at one document, a rolling internal memo listing resignations and transfers from precincts connected to Keller's command history. She skimmed the names. No celebration, no gloating, just one sentence whispered to herself like a principle finally proven true. You don't need fire, you only need light. The people who once covered for Brent weren't converting into heroes. They weren't waking up. They were simply realizing that proximity to his name had become toxic. The truth wasn't redeeming them, it was expelling them, like poison being purged from a closed circuit. Brent saw the shift. He felt it in doorways that didn't open, in greetings that no longer came. Even the ones who hadn't quit avoided eye contact. One officer he trained crossed the hallway just to not passing him directly. Another, once his golf partner, returned his calls with, "I can't be seen involved in this, Brent. No confrontation, no argument, just cold, professional abandonment, like a disease being contained through distancing." He tried to stage his defense, not in public, but in the locker room, where reputation once pulsed strongest. "They're turning their backs on 30 years of service," he growled, eyes flicking to the younger recruits. But no one answered, no one bit. One simply folded his vest and walked out. Silence again, louder than shouting. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about legacy, about what happens when the structure that once validated you begins to delete you to survive, when the tribe no longer calls your name, when your past isn't just questioned, it's erased to preserve the future of those who once backed you. The institution didn't burn Brent Keller. It left him behind. The system didn't condemn him. It revised him out of the record like an algorithm, purging corrupted data. And Elise, she never even stepped into the same room. Her justice wasn't vengeance, it was alignment. Her silence didn't shame them, it revealed them. No rallying cry, no manifesto, just a calibrated exposure of the truth they already knew but refused to face, until it cost them more to stay silent than to step away. By the time the institution had erased his name and the Brotherhood had left him behind, Brent Keller still clung to one illusion, that home would remain untouched, that beneath the ruin and the noise, his family would survive the smoke. But truth, when it pierces silence, doesn't knock, it detonates. It happened on a Wednesday evening, wrapped in normalcy. His 10-year-old son sat cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping channels, the remote heavy in his small hand. He wasn't looking for anything, just cartoons or noise to dull the unease he'd picked up from adults who whispered too close to him these days. But then the image blinked onto the screen. A woman, elderly, cornered on a sunlit sidewalk, her hands trembling, her voice barely audible beneath the pressure of a man's grip. And that man, unmistakably, horrifically familiar, was his father. The footage played raw, unedited. Brent's voice cut through the television with the same sharp command he used at home when the boy left toys on the stairs. "Hands behind your back. Stop resisting." But the woman wasn't resisting. She was gasping. Her knees buckled against hot metal. Her eyes pleaded. His father's hands didn't waver. When his father's hands didn't waver, the boy didn't speak. He didn't blink. He watched until the clip ended, until the silence in the room swallowed the last line of static. Then, slowly, he turned to his father, who had just stepped in from the kitchen, holding a glass of water he no longer remembered picking up. The boy looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, with something far more devastating, confusion. "Dad?" he asked, voice smaller than the room could bear. "Why did you push that lady?" And Brent, officer, enforcer, shielded icon of order, stood frozen, glass in hand, suddenly unsure how to breathe. His mind, trained for rebuttal, instinctively reached for one of a dozen stock responses. She resisted. It was protocol. She was non-compliant. But none of them made it past his teeth, not because he suddenly found a conscience, but because for the first time in his life, the lie wouldn't stick. Not to his son, not in that room, not after everything else had crumbled. He said nothing. The glass trembled, his jaw tightened. The boy waited, then, quietly, turned his head back to the screen. That night, no one yelled. No plates were broken, no ultimatums, just the slow sound of drawers being opened, clothes folded, zippers pulled. His wife didn't weep. She packed with the precision of someone who'd already mourned the man she once loved and was now simply collecting the pieces she could still salvage. At the edge of the dining table, she left a note, not addressed to Brent, not filled with accusations, just one simple line in her son's handwriting. "I don't understand this, but I don't want to grow up like that." Brent didn't stop him. He couldn't. By then, the floor beneath him had already vanished. His authority meant nothing in that house, not in the eyes of the boy who once wore his badge as a toy, not in the heart of the woman who had watched his image rot from protector to headline. He found them 2 days later. at her sister's place on the outskirts of town. She opened the door halfway, enough to look him in the eyes, but not enough to invite him in. No screams, no insults, just her voice, clear and toneless. "I'm scared our son will become you." He stood there for a moment longer, holding nothing, saying nothing. Then he turned around, walked back to his car, and didn't start it. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Not the silence of peace, but of vacancy. Toys that once littered the hall were gone. The sofa had an indent where his son used to curl up with cartoons. In the kitchen, a cereal bowl still sat in the sink. Dried milk crusted along its edges, like time had hardened what should have been washed away. Brent moved to the bedroom, but it felt like trespassing. He walked past, ended up in the living room, and just stood there, hands limp, eyes hollow. Then, like instinct, like ritual, like a man trying to feel grounded, he bent down and touched the pair of shoes by the door. His duty boots, thick, scuffed, the leather worn by years of power, still caked in traces of city dust. He had worn them every day since academy graduation. They had become part of his posture, part of his command. He sat on the floor and placed them beside him. Then he stared. The overhead light flickered. Cheap wiring he never bothered fixing. The wood beneath him was cold, sharp in places where varnish had worn. He reached for the laces out of habit, then stopped. And for the first time since the system turned, since the department purged him, since the badge was stripped and the walls abandoned him, Brent Keller did something no one could have expected. He took the boots off, slowly, carefully, as if undressing a uniform he no longer deserved. He placed them next to each other, soles touching, perfectly aligned. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, he didn't move. He just sat there, in the center of an empty room, surrounded by absence, staring at the last thing that had made him feel like a man of meaning, and he did not stand up again. The shoes stayed on the floor. The room didn't move. Brent Keller had become a monument to everything he could no longer command. Silent, stripped, forgotten. But the silence that swallowed him didn't stretch outward into the void. It moved with purpose. It traveled, not as a scream, not as a riot, but as a whisper woven into code, comment, classroom, and conscience. And in that quiet movement, something louder than noise began to rise. It started digitally, as most modern reckonings do. The hashtag #KellerJustice, once a rallying cry for defenders of law and order, vanished, not abruptly, but like a slogan slowly embarrassed by its weight. It stopped trending, it stopped appearing, and in its place, quietly at first, emerged a new phrase, Monroe Doctrine. Not trending, not flashy, just persistent. No one knew who posted it first. Maybe it was the student from Milwaukee who watched the hearings and noticed how one woman's silence reshaped more than a courtroom. Maybe it was the tech worker in D.C. who saw the legal filings unfold like clockwork and realized someone had built a system of resistance, not just a reaction. But once the phrase appeared, it never left. It wasn't attached to violence. It wasn't about sides. It was a line in the sand that asked one question over and over. Who gets to define what justice looks like? An anonymous account, no bio, no face, just a single symbol of a locked file, posted the quote that cracked the algorithm. This isn't revenge. It's a reminder of who holds the pen when the system forgets its lines. Thousands liked it. Thousands more copied it. Some didn't even know who Elise Monroe was, but they felt the gravity. She didn't chase the narrative. She reshaped it by refusing to explain herself. And that silence, precise, dignified, intentional, became a new kind of sound. One newspaper, not national but widely syndicated, ran a Sunday editorial with a title that didn't ask permission. The modern Rosa Parks doesn't ride buses. She rewrites the route. The article didn't quote Elise. It couldn't. She had declined every interview, no appearances, no rebuttals. But that, somehow, gave the piece more power. It wasn't about her words. It was about what her silence did to the world around her. Policy shifted. Laws opened. Officers resigned. Departments rewrote internal codes. and not once did she step onto a podium. In the halls of a university across the country, a law student, barely 21, overworked, underfunded, deeply inspired, printed a black-and-white photo of Elise, the only one available from her federal badge years. No filters, no slogans, just her eyes locked in unblinking focus. Beneath it, scrawled in thick Sharpie, the student wrote, "I'm studying law because she didn't scream," and the system still bent. The poster wasn't hung on a wall, it was taped to the inside of a dorm room door. It didn't go viral, it didn't need to. It lived in real places, in conversations, in classrooms, in the space between how things were and how they should have always been. Elise never acknowledged the hashtag. She didn't retweet the quote. She didn't thank the student. She didn't answer the journalist's requests for comment, nor appear on any panels suddenly clamoring to crown her a voice of the movement. She didn't need to. That was the point. Her power had never come from attention. It had come from structure. She hadn't raised her voice to disrupt the system. She had understood the system so completely she no longer needed to shout to shake it. People tried to define her. They called her a strategist, a quiet revolutionary, a constitutional architect. But the most accurate word was one no one could agree on, because it didn't exist yet. Elise wasn't a role model. She was a reminder of what happens when someone stops asking permission to be taken seriously. Her silence wasn't passive, it was curated, a tactical non-response in a world addicted to reaction. And somehow, that restraint made her louder than any protest could have. She didn't burn buildings. She didn't march with megaphones. She wrote legal code in shadows and let it collapse the towers of pretense. A youth debate team in Texas used her strategy as a case study. A startup in Oregon named its compliance AI after her. A single mother in Baltimore told her daughter, "Speak when you must, but remember, you can also win with quiet that breaks bones." Elise didn't see any of it. She was already working on the next thing. Not a campaign, not a book deal, something cleaner, quieter, lasting. What rose from her silence wasn't fame, it was clarity. And in that rising, for the first time in years, power listened. It didn't erupt, it unfolded, quiet as ink, sharp as consequence. What Elise had initiated through silence now seeped into policy, into process, into permanence. The movement didn't march, it legislated, and for the first time in years, the laws that once turned a blind eye were forced to open both in a private chamber buried beneath marble walls and procedural jargon. An amendment moved through the Federal Law Enforcement Procedures Act. No flashbulbs, no political theater, just a line of text added to a bill already scheduled for renewal. But this one line, invisible to the general public, recalibrated how power was allowed to behave. Unofficially, they called it the Monroe Clause. Officially, it was nothing more than Section 7B, subsection 9.4. Its language was clinical. In any federal or local law enforcement engagement, the physical detainment of unarmed individuals aged 65 and above, without imminent threat assessment, shall constitute a discriminatory abuse of authority and will be subject to expedited federal review. A mouthful. To some, a revolution to others. It wasn't framed as an apology. It wasn't sold as justice. It was statute, uncompromising, traceable, enforceable. And beneath its exacting diction lived a truth born from bruised skin, broken silence, and a nation forced to ask what kind of strength it took to hurt those who couldn't fight back. Elise didn't attend the vote. She wasn't invited. She wasn't mentioned. But she was there, in every clause, every margin note, every revision that made its way from committee to chamber. Her fingerprints weren't on the paper, they were in the structure. One junior policy analyst, confused by the lack of attribution, asked during review, "Who wrote this language? It doesn't sound like any of ours." A superior shrugged. "Someone who understands force better than we do." It passed unanimously, quietly, as if the law finally was too embarrassed to argue. Word spread slowly, first through interagency emails, then through seminars, then through police union trainings, suddenly updated with mandatory refreshers. Chiefs of departments in states like Illinois, Oregon, and Pennsylvania requested briefings on how to implement the Monroe Clause before federal funding reviews. It wasn't optional. It was the new bar, and no one wanted to be Kellered again. An intern at a reform think tank uploaded the clause into a searchable database and added tags: elder rights, force restrictions, racial equity, and Monroe. Within a week, it had over 10,000 hits. The irony was rich. Elise had never branded herself, but now her name was encoded in legal frameworks, whispered in training halls, cited in academic papers, referenced in department memos, all without her ever lifting her voice. Someone, during a closed-door panel on procedural ethics, posed the inevitable question: why didn't she claim credit? One attendee, a mid-level justice consultant who had never met Elise but understood her reach, answered without pause, because she didn't write it for herself. She wrote it for the people who hold guns and forgot what they were supposed to protect. And that was it. That was the sentence that echoed through 100 rooms where badges were reissued and policies were rewritten. Because in those spaces, in those offices once untouched by doubt, the Monroe Clause wasn't just a rule. It was a mirror, a reminder that every exemption once carved into law had been noticed, documented, and now dismantled by a woman who never asked for vengeance, only for responsibility. Brent's name didn't appear in any of the drafts, but his ghost lived in the spaces between every line. His hands, once armored by complacency, had triggered a legal calibration that would outlive every headline. He had been the catalyst. Elise had been the cure. She reviewed the final language from a private server, alone, methodical, and unsentimental. She read each word as though it were a surgical tool. She made no edits. She saved it. And when someone reached out, some political operative trying to drag her into a press tour, offering credit, interviews, profile pieces, she declined with a line that later would be framed on the wall of a policymaker's office. "I didn't write my name into the law. I wrote the weight of the people who carry weapons. That's enough." The Monroe Clause didn't go viral. It went deeper. It embedded. It regulated. It bled into precincts, case law, and expectations. And every time a young officer hesitated before touching the arm of an elder, before reaching for cuffs out of habit instead of necessity, it wasn't because of fear. It was because something had shifted, quietly, legally, irrevocably. Elise didn't make history with volume. She did it with precision. And now, in every room where power once went unchecked, her silence hung like law. The Monroe Clause had already moved. It was the law. It was effective. It was reality reshaped by restraint, and yet no one had seen the architect. No cameras had captured her. No voice had recorded her words since the system changed. Elise had become a myth by intention. But then, one invitation landed on her desk. Not from the press, not from politicians hungry for association, but from the procedural committee itself. "You may speak, if you wish." She did not respond with a yes. She simply showed up. The auditorium was neutral, hollow, designed for utility over spectacle. Rows of pressed suits, tight jaw lines, and note-taking hands filled the seats. Microphones stood like waiting swords. Cameras blinked in standby, hungry for her face, her tone, her flaw. Outside, headlines were drafted before she even arrived. The woman who rewrote justice, the silent hammer, from victim to vanguard. But inside, everything waited on pause. Elise entered without an entourage. No handlers, no makeup, no pre-written statement in hand. Her posture was composed, but unadorned. Her shoes made no sound. She walked to the podium, stopped, and let the quiet stretch, not as a delay, but as a command. In that space, in that measured stillness, the room began to understand she wasn't there to participate. She was there to finalize. She scanned the room once, slowly, not to gauge approval, but to make sure they were watching. Then she leaned slightly forward, spoke once, clearly, with the precision of a judge issuing a sentence designed for eternity. "When law forgets how to love, I will teach it to kneel before those it once crushed. That was it. No elaboration, no pause for applause, no indulgence in questions. Her voice neither rose nor cracked. It didn't seek sympathy or awe. It cut, cold, surgical. Enough, the silence that followed was not passive. It was thunder in disguise. Journalists blinked, stunned out of their rehearsed follow-ups. One man, veteran reporter, once cynical beyond repair, lowered his pen and wept silently, not because he understood everything, but because in that one sentence he finally knew what justice should have always sounded like. Elise stepped back. No nod, no wave. She turned without a flourish and walked out exactly as she came, in control, untouched, absolute. The cameras followed her until the last edge of her coat disappeared into the corridor. They wanted more, but she had already given them everything that mattered. Back in a dim living room lit by the flicker of a dusty TV, Brent Keller sat frozen. The screen held her image for a moment longer before cutting to commentary he didn't hear. The world had sentenced him not with charges, but with transformation. Not by one voice, but by all the ones that rose in her wake. And in that moment, it finally settled. He hadn't been undone by a case. He had been eclipsed by a language he could never speak. Elise had rewritten justice, not as vengeance, not as noise, but as proof, and the world had listened because she didn't ask it to. She had exited the press conference like a punctuation mark carved in marble. One sentence, no retake, no retreat. And after that, she was gone. Not vanished, not buried, just out of reach. Elise Monroe did not capitalize on her silence. She left it hanging like a banner only the observant could read. But while her voice disappeared from stages, her name began to echo, not in headlines or algorithms, but in the quieter places where change grows. The first reflection didn't come from a politician or pundit, but from a man who'd once seen her in the back of a classroom, unassuming, precise, unshakably still. Professor Dorian Lake, now retired, published an op-ed in the Atlantic Law Review titled simply, "The Girl Who Never Spoke Out Loud." He recalled her without embellishment. Elise Monroe wasn't the student who dominated discussion. She never raised her hand. She never tried to impress. But when she wrote, she carved into the fabric of the case like it owed her blood. He confessed that in 20 years of teaching jurisprudence, he had never seen someone so completely disappear into the structure of law, only to later re-emerge from it as the force that rewrote its frame. The article went viral within academic circles, not because it praised her, but because it explained her without trying to own her. Professors forwarded it, students printed it, deans called emergency roundtables to discuss the Monroe effect, and somewhere in that storm a paragraph surfaced from a government file, the kind not easily found unless you knew where to dig. It was a scanned copy of Elise's application to the National Legal Reform Advisory Council, submitted 3 years before the world knew her name. In it, a single line leapt from the page, black ink on gray-white bureaucracy. I am not here to be known. I am here to silence what has been ignored. It wasn't self-righteous. It wasn't poetic. It was a promise, and one she had fulfilled with terrifying precision. A feature profile appeared 2 weeks later in Policy Now, not sanctioned, not authorized. The title was severe and surgical. The woman who made silence cut the deepest. It wasn't flattering. It was forensic. The author dissected her trajectory. Misconduct complaint denied at 21, academic suspension, scholarship rescinded, re-entry through alternative institutions, and finally her infiltration of procedural law bodies through backdoor certifications and airtight policy recommendations. The piece concluded, Elise Monroe didn't break the system. She rewrote its code and let it execute itself. What followed wasn't fame. It was a function. University admissions saw a spike in applications, citing strategic legislation as a declared focus. Law schools reported a surge in students requesting independent study and procedural auditing. A new wave of legal scholars stopped asking how to argue cases and started learning how to write the rules that decide them before courtrooms even open. And always, always, her name was mentioned, not a celebrity, as a blueprint. Conference panels were built around concepts she birthed. Government task forces began structuring reform protocols based on the Monroe Clause. Professors who once dismissed procedural law as bureaucratic deadweight now call it the next front line of ethical warfare. And in every dossier, slide deck, or curriculum update, there it was, Elise Monroe, model, strategic silence in legal disruption. But Elise herself, nowhere. She did not attend the panels. She declined honorary doctorates. She refused to sit for profiles or pose for portraits. She didn't even authorize quotes. Her last known official communication was a single-line email to a policy institute asking them to remove her image from their marketing banner. I didn't change the system to be its next mascot. Even so, her presence spread, not through endorsement, but through embedded logic. Systems began to whisper her name with reverence. Not out of worship, but out of a kind of fear, respect usually reserved for architects of revolution who never raised flags. She became the answer to problems others hadn't known how to name. Her approach, write the rule before you need the protest, became the golden phrase of a generation that had seen too many movements shout themselves hoarse without ever rewriting the fine print. She was not canonized, she was codified, and that difference was everything. No plaques, no speeches, just protocols, just reform, just new lines and old laws that now bore the marks of her fingers even though she never signed them. Elise Monroe did not become the face of justice, she became its infrastructure. And in the places where power once dismissed her, they now quote her, not because they understand her, but because they know ignoring her again would be fatal. Her name had become the foundation. He had become warning. While Elise Monroe faded into infrastructure, Brent Keller drifted into absence. Not exile, not punishment, just a vacancy no one cared to fill. What remained wasn't disgrace, it was redundancy. And that, for a man who had once wielded fear like a second language, was the cruelest sentence of all. He applied first where his reflexes told him to, a private security firm near the docks, barely a step above rent-a-cop work. The interviewer skimmed the resume, paused at the name, then gave him a rehearsed nod that didn't quite reach eye level. "We'll call you." He knew they wouldn't. A week later, a friend from inside sent him a screenshot of the hiring log. Keller, do not advance liability risk. The word liability had never touched him before. Now it trailed him like a scent. He tried again. Rideshare company, late hours, minimal contact, but a background check triggered internal flags, and somewhere, someone filed an anonymous petition. Would you want your grandmother driven home by him? He didn't even get to the onboarding screen. The denials didn't hurt as much as the silences. They didn't reject him with outrage, they dismissed him like a malfunction, quietly replaced, quietly forgotten. He changed tactics. Small towns, temp gigs. No resumes, no questions. At a corner grocery store, he handed in a handwritten application. The manager looked him up and down, smiled thinly, and said they'd consider him for night stock. A day later, the storefront window bore a notice under the words, "Community first. We do not hire those who once chose to forget what humanity looks like." Next to the notice was a printed image, a still from the body cam video. His face, half in shadow, eyes cold, hand gripping the arm of an elderly woman collapsing beneath the weight of a world she never chose to be born into. Brent stopped entering through the front doors. He began calling places anonymously, asking if they needed help off the books. They didn't, or if they did, they didn't need him. Everywhere he went, someone knew. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to lean in and whisper. Enough to tilt their phones at each other. Enough to lock a register drawer just a little faster. He would walk into gas stations and hear it before he saw it. Soft murmurs laced with disbelief. "That's him, right? The one who cuffed that old lady?" not shouted, just known. He tried changing his name, not legally, he couldn't afford that, but on applications, on phone inquiries, on introductions. Sometimes he used Brent Kellen, sometimes Brian Keeler, but the minute he had to sign anything official, his hand would tremble, his pen would stall, and even when he scrawled fake names, his signature still betrayed the man he used to be. Assertive, angular, overly sure. An afternoon, in a grimy government office waiting to register for part-time labor, he filled out a form and reached the signature line. His fingers locked, not from age, from memory. He stared at the box, pen tip hovering, and muttered under his breath, "Who the hell am I signing for?" No one answered, not even himself. The mirror became his only audience. He avoided it at first, then, slowly, began to face it, like an interrogation room. No questions, only judgment. His eyes, once sharp with command, looked back, dull and unfamiliar. His uniform had been armor. His badge was been identity. Without them, he wasn't a former officer. He wasn't anything. He was a gap, a leftover. Standing before the mirror one morning, shirt wrinkled, face sagging, hair thinned to suggestion, he asked himself aloud, "Who is Brent Keller if there's no one left to salute him?" The silence that followed was so full, so final, it echoed. There was no courtroom to redeem him, no cell to absolve him. His fall wasn't cinematic, it was administrative, slow, and bureaucratic annihilation. His erasure didn't come from fire, it came from indifference. He passed stores that once gave discounts to police. Now they held policies that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who once refused compassion." He used to wear his badge to cut lines. Now he stood behind mothers and janitors and teenagers who didn't look at him twice. The world hadn't punished Brent Keller, it had simply outgrown him. And in that truth, undramatic, absolute, cold as concrete, he discovered something worse than guilt. He had become irrelevant. He had faded into irrelevance, she into something deeper. While Brent Keller wandered through a world that had stopped calling his name, Elise Monroe moved through one that no longer needed to. Her presence was no longer tracked, it was felt. Not on screens, not in quotes, but in the reordering of principles, in the policies left unsigned by corruption, in the questions asked in law classes where her name wasn't invoked, but understood. Whisper and procedural law review sessions, a case study without a face. Students no longer recited her words. They studied what she had removed, what she had refused to say, how the refusal itself had become architecture. And beneath it all, quietly, the culture shifted, not from applause, but from alignment. No movement announced her, no foundation bore her name, yet officers paused where they once acted on instinct. Clauses were cited not to defend, but to limit force. And Keller, long discarded by policy, remained on the outskirts not of public life, but of memory itself. His exile was not punishment. It was a void no institution dared to refill. The first mural, painted in a public school hallway in his hometown, depicted hands, not raised in protest, but gently closing the door to a precinct. The image went viral after a student captioned it, "There are some names the law learns to forget." Brent saw it on a stranger's phone, in line at a pharmacy, standing behind someone who didn't recognize him, and felt his knees stiffen not from outrage but from the strange ache of being unnamed. Later that month, a journalist posted an archival photo of Keller in uniform with the phrase, "This file has been deprecated," stamped across his chest like a design. The post hit 1 million shares within a day, turned into t-shirts, memes, and eventually became the cover art for a podcast called Dead Code, How Systems Self-Correct. When he walked into a corner store one evening, a teen cashier quietly slid a paper bag toward him with the words, "We don't ask questions, but we also don't forget." He took the bag, left the cash, and walked into a night too silent for a man who once defined noise. At a downtown cinema, a short documentary about abuse of force included a reenactment of Keller's infamous sidewalk detainment. The actor cast to play him had fewer lines than anyone else. He simply appeared, held the pose, and faded out mid-scene as the voiceover said, "Some ghosts don't haunt, they vanish, and the silence teaches louder than their commands ever did." Brent sat 3 rows from the back, collar turned up, hands buried in his jacket, and left before the credits rolled. He didn't see the audience lean forward in those final moments, didn't hear the quiet claps that followed, not celebratory, but reflexive, like muscle memory after years of silence, learning how to move again. He tried to reclaim a name through utility, offering to volunteer at a local precinct's community watch program. But the request was denied with a form letter that closed. "Your history no longer fits the shape of what we protect." It wasn't rage, it was pruning. Systemic, quiet, deliberate. He stopped applying. He started disappearing, not by force, but by default. Meanwhile, Elise existed in blueprints, in margins of white papers where her methods were now footnoted, in the redesign of oversight training modules used by departments too nervous to repeat old patterns. A criminal justice symposium titled Architecture Without Architects featured a case study called Monroe's Silence, citing not her voice, but her omissions. One speaker, respected, seasoned, unimpressed by grandstanding, summed her legacy with a line that circulated online for weeks. She redefined reform not by burning systems, but by refusing to speak to them until they reassembled. No credit given, none sought, yet her signature lingered where ink had never touched. In a reform lab in Colorado, interns debated whether policy was the new protest. At a think tank in Atlanta, her strategy model was assigned for reading, and in courtrooms, attorneys began referencing patterns instead of people, evidence structured around choices made, not character cited. She had removed herself from the center, and in doing so became the axis. And still, she remained untouched by spectacle. Her absence was so deliberate it felt sacred. She made no comment when her work was praised, no defense when it was challenged, no appearance when the awards arrived in envelopes, never opened. She existed like an equation already solved, no longer needing repetition, only application. Yet even as systems carried her legacy forward like circuitry remembering its source code, there remained one place untouched, one thread unsaid, one silence she still owed someone, her mother. It was early when she arrived. The sky still wore the faint blue of morning restraint, and the earth hadn't yet warmed enough to crack beneath footsteps. Elise walked without entourage, without shield, without the weight of everything she had moved, because in that space there was no court, no clause, no doctrine, just a woman, a grave, and the echo of a voice long gone but never absent. She knelt, not out of ceremony but instinct, in her hands a bouquet of white calla lilies, clean, unbending, silent. She placed them gently on the stone, brushed away the faint dust that had settled over time. The granite was modest, unpolished, but deliberate. No dates, no epithets, no grandeur, just a line, carved with a precision only those who had lived through silence could understand. Where silence lived, my mother taught me how to make the world listen. Before the world learned her name through legislation and legacy, before systems adjusted around the vacuum she created, there was only the noise she chose not to make. And before that, there had been the voice she learned to bury. Her mother's warnings, her pauses, her gaze that measured the danger of every room before a single word was spoken. Brent Keller's name hadn't just faded, it had calcified into a caution. Somewhere in a high school civics class, a student once muttered his name during a heated debate. The teacher stopped the discussion and simply said, "That's not a case, that's a collapse," and no one needed further explanation. At a city mural unveiling that featured Elise's doctrine painted in legal script spiraling around a black wall, someone tagged over Keller's name in red, "Do not restore." The image circulated online for weeks, captioned only with the phrase, errors in uniform. The damage hadn't ended with his removal. It had multiplied under scrutiny. A former precinct he once commanded was caught fabricating statistics to inflate his record, and when it unraveled, their statement read, "We regret building walls on rotten steel." Even those who once defended him now referenced him only as a structural flaw, a warning built into future codes of conduct. In one particularly scathing expose, a journalist traced Keller's incidents back 2 decades and ended the piece with, "His silence now is not penance, it's the only safe sound left to him." The community responded by projecting the quote onto the side of the old courthouse he once strode through daily. The projection stayed lit until the building was repurposed as a resource center for systemic bias intervention. None of that mattered here, not in the stillness of this plot of earth, not in the space where granite remembered better than people did. Elise remained kneeling, her hands motionless, not from grief, but from memory. This was not where tears belonged. This was where truth settled, the kind not shouted or litigated, the kind only a daughter could carry through the bloodline of silence. Behind her, a breeze shifted the dry grass. A car rolled by, but she didn't turn. She could feel how the world had changed, not in noise, but in restraint, not in who held power, but in how quickly silence now made space for consequence. 3 blocks away, Keller passed a public park, renamed after one of the victims in the class action that had ended his tenure. A child pointed to his face, barely aged but unmistakable, printed in a grainy photo on a laminated flyer stapled to a wooden post. Caution, known for past abuse of authority. He kept his head down, pretending not to see, pretending not to exist. But the city didn't erase him. It framed him as a fracture, as a cautionary relic from a time no one wanted to admit they once applauded. And while Elise made herself smaller with every stride away from fame, the void she left demanded integrity fill it, or be swallowed whole. In an anonymous op-ed written by someone rumored to be a federal judge, the author noted that the legacy of Elise Monroe is not made of verdicts, but absences, of headlines she refused, of interviews she declined, of victories she never celebrated. In that refusal lies a blueprint. The line was quoted, reshared, inked into the margins of academic books, used in commencement speeches, and printed on shirts students wore under their robes. Yet she never corrected or confirmed its origin, never added a footnote, never needed to, because her silence wasn't a vacancy, it was gravity, a force not seen but felt, and it drew everything crooked toward equilibrium. The lilies at her fingertips didn't bend, not under the sun, not under time. They stood as she did, unapologetically precise. She traced the carved line on the stone once more, not to revisit, but to anchor. Behind her, a child's voice rose in the wind, drifting through like a question not meant to be answered, the kind of voice too young to know the legacy, but old enough to feel a presence. Elise turned her head slightly, not in acknowledgement but in permission, letting the world ask, letting the silence shape the answer. And when the wind finally passed and the petals stilled, she stood without drama, without the ceremony of closure, because there was no closure, only continuation. She stepped back, her shadow long but not cast. There was no need to linger. The stone said what she never would, and the world, at last, had learned to listen to what wasn't said. Where silence lived, my mother taught me how to make the world listen. The air, drowsy with late autumn light, carried the scent of old leaves and something faintly bitter. Smoke from a chimney far off, perhaps, or the remnants of a memory refusing to dissipate. Elise remained still. Behind her sunglasses, her eyes didn't blink. Not from stoicism, but because blinking would allow something in dust, a tear, or worse, remembrance. The grave bore no flowers, only a small stone worn down from years of unspoken visits. Her mother had never liked flowers. She said they were dishonest, always blooming for the wrong reasons. Elise once thought that was bitterness talking, but now she knew it had been precision. She looked down at the gravestone again, the letters engraved with exactness, as though silence itself had held the chisel. What was not written was louder than what was, and yet the world had once shouted her mother's name, shouted it, twisted it, dragged it across headlines like a curse in cursive. When the trial collapsed and the photographs were leaked, no one spoke of evidence, only of expression. One image, her mother, stooping to pick up a dropped glove outside the courthouse. Her face half-turned, her hair wind-blown, became fodder for 1,000 slurs online. The woman who didn't cry when accused, the woman who didn't flinch when they called her a traitor to her child. That year, Elise learned not to search her family name. The internet had found the footage of the confrontation outside the school gates. The woman, an emboldened stranger, had spat at her mother's feet and hissed, "You don't deserve to walk on the same ground your daughter bled on." No one intervened, not the school staff, not the bystanders. Just a slow pan of phone cameras tracking the silence. Months later, a senator's wife, seated beside Elise's mother at a charity gala, abruptly stood up and switched seats with another guest, muttering loud enough for cameras to catch, "I'll not be seen beside her." Not with what she let happen. Applause had continued in the background, music played, and a silent woman sat between golden cutlery and contempt. Years passed. But echoes calcify. When Elise was invited to speak at a university panel on resilience, one student stood during Q&A and asked, "Do you think you'd be here if your mother hadn't failed as spectacularly as she did?" Laughter followed. Not all of it is nervous. And Elise had smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that disarmed not because it was warm, but because it was rehearsed. She had replied, "Maybe not, but I don't think you'll be invited back, either." That moment trended for 12 hours. The university deleted the recording, but not before it reached the inbox of every news outlet that had once buried her mother's name beneath veiled innuendo. It was only last month, long after the headlines had changed fonts and the outrage industry found new targets, that a man, once her mother's colleague, sent Elise a message. He had been silent for decades. His email contained a single sentence. "She was the only one who never sold us out when they offered immunity." No signature, no apology, just an obituary of guilt wrapped in cowardice. Elise had stared at it for hours, not because she wanted to reply, but because she didn't. And now, standing here, coat shifting against the slow breaths of November wind, she realized something deeper than resentment, deeper even than grief. The most violent thing the world had done to her mother was not accuse her, not convict her, not even abandon her, but pretend she never existed after. The headlines stopped, but no one said she had been wronged. They simply moved on, left her to the quiet, not out of respect, but because they preferred forgetting to confessing. Left her to the quiet, not out of respect, but because they preferred forgetting to confessing. The woman in the grave had been erased so thoroughly that even memory flinched at her name. And yet, she was still here, in the stone, in the cold, in the daughter who came not to mourn, but to refuse absence. It was then that she heard the light, curious shuffle of small shoes behind her. The sound didn't startle her. Instead, it threaded itself into the moment like it belonged. She waited without turning until the child came to stand beside her. A girl, no more than 7, cheeks pink from the cold, her hair tied in 2 uneven braids, the kind a child did herself when no one else had time. The girl said nothing at first, just looked at Elise with that raw, fearless interest children sometimes have for grief they don't yet understand. Then she looked at the stone, lips moving as she read, "Where silence lived." She paused, thoughtful. Then she asked, "Who was she?" The grass was still damp from the morning rain, though the sun had already begun its reluctant climb behind the veil of clouds. Elise's steps pressed gently into the softened earth, leaving no imprint deep enough to last. Her coat shifted slightly as the wind curled around her legs, and the air carried that metallic scent of distance, like time had paused here, reluctant to let go. There had been a day years ago when her mother stood in a church, not as a mourner, but as the accused, her shoulders squared under the stares of men who once called her by her first name. They didn't whisper then, they shouted, and when the footage leaked of her turning her back on the press as they ambushed her outside the parish doors, there were comments about her posture, not her pain. One radio host asked mockingly, "If she's innocent, why doesn't she look sorry?" Another said, "You don't wear navy blue to a funeral if you care about the dead." Elise remembered how someone posted a photo of her mother waiting in line at a pharmacy the week after, the caption dripping with venom. Funny how monsters still get headaches like the rest of us. No one had asked what she was buying. No one had noticed the receipt in her hand was for insulin. When a neighbor's dog died suddenly, 3 houses down, someone spray-painted across her garage, "Poison sleeps next door." And that winter, during the school charity drive, Elise was pulled aside by the head of the parent council and told with a smile as tight as piano wire that her family's donations would be graciously declined to preserve community comfort. Years passed, comfort remained untouched. Her mother faded from headlines, but not from silence. That silence had mass, shape, and gravity. Elise carried it now in her bones, not as a burden, but as a language. She said nothing as she met the girl's gaze, so small, so unshaped by the sharp edges of grown-up spite. Her eyes held no malice, only the quiet wish to understand. Elise turned, not suddenly, not theatrically, just enough to meet the girl's eyes. She did not answer with words. She didn't have to. Her smile was soft, steady, final. Not an invitation, not a dismissal, just a gift of presence. Then she turned back to the path and walked on. Not faster, not slower, simply forward. The girl looked back at the stone, then at the sky. She didn't follow. And the camera, if there had been one, would not have followed Elise either. It would have lingered, not on her figure retreating into the distance, but on the stone, on the wind, on the unmoving white lilies, on the silence that wasn't empty, but full of everything that had been said without sound. There would be no closing credits, no voiceover, no swelling music, just the inscription, waiting for whoever came next, and it would say everything.